This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today's conversation is with Professor William Chafe. He's going to be talking about President Obama and the civil rights legacy. Everyone watching is invited to ask Professor Chafe a question. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and Professor Chafe, here we are at your online office hours. Let's just hit a few highlights about you. You have literally written the textbook about modern American history. In fact, two of them, The Unfinished Journey and The Rise and Fall of the American Century. Here at Duke, you are the Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of History, and you are fresh back from South Africa, where you've been working on a comparison study between the anti-apartheid struggle there and the U.S. civil rights movement here. I think you've been back in the U.S. long enough to know that there's building chatter about President Obama coming up on the one-year mark in office, and there's some polls out that are showing his approval rating is down to about 50%. So you're a professor. What grade would you give President Obama on his first year in office?
Professor's not bad because he is very
That's right, he has that demeanor, sure, okay.
Well, I would give him a pretty good grade, but I'm a supporter of his. So, but I think if you think about the fact that he really faces the most difficult challenges that any president has ever faced, probably more difficult, except for Abraham Lincoln. Not only does he have the economic recession/depression that FDR had, 2 wars, massive climate change, the need to somehow bring people back together. This is a set of challenges that really is unprecedented in our history. And I think that given the dimension of the crisis that he faces, I think he's done a pretty good job. One of the things I think is important to say is that a lot of people, I think, expect too much of the president. They look back at FDR and the New Deal, and they think, most people think, that FDR and the New Deal solved the Great Depression. Totally not true. The Great Depression was as bad in 1938. In fact, it was the worst, the nadir of the Great Depression came in 38, as it was in 32 when he took office. What solved the Great Depression was World War II. Full employment came back with World War II, but we cannot afford a world war. So we're not going to solve our economic crisis with that kind of a war. But I think people need to recognize that FDR didn't perform miracles, and Barack Obama is not going to perform miracles. What he has done, obviously, is some fairly decisive intervention in terms of the stimulus package and in terms of trying to get the economy back on track. I think that all the evidence is that the economy is now starting to grow again. Jobs clearly are a big problem. But that's always been true of these kinds of historic recessions. But I think people have to recognize that we are in a fairly unprecedented situation, and so it would be helpful to cut the president a little bit of slack.
Gotcha. Now, you've written op-eds drawing these kind of historical lessons, both with FDR and his handling of the Great Depression, and also Lyndon Johnson and how he handled or mishandled the Vietnam War. So what are those lessons that you'd pass on?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that the interesting thing about Johnson, is that Johnson, when he was elected for the first time, actually in '64, he became president, obviously, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But Lyndon Johnson had a massive mandate, and he had a Congress that was really pretty compliant. Johnson, when he took office, basically told all of his chief aides, we've got to act quickly because this is not going to last long. And so we have with Johnson federal aid to education, Medicare, the war on poverty, model cities, urban renewal, all kinds of things that are dramatic, the most amazing batch of legislation since the New Deal. Now, that all would have led to a very significant domestic transition had it not been for the Vietnam War. One of the points I'd like to make here, though, is that, see, Johnson had a compliant Congress at first. We have a Congress right now which is not compliant with Barack Obama. We have a Democratic Party which I would argue is right of center, not left of center. Okay. And therefore, we expect some things of the Democratic Party that really it's not ready to provide.
Now, how are the Democrats, you're saying they're not liberal, today's Democrats?
Most Democrats today are not liberal.
How's that?
Well, it's because of the transition that took place in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, when you have a new kind of conservative consensus, starting with Richard Nixon, going through Ronald Reagan. Don't forget, Bill Clinton was elected president with 43% of the vote in 1992. So we're not talking, and Democratic Congress, the Democratic Party became considerably less liberal over the period of time in the 80s and 90s. So we're really not talking about the same kind of liberal Democratic Party today in Congress that you had in 1965. You're talking about a very different kind of experience. Now, on the war issue, I think the most important difference between Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama is the fact that Johnson made most of the decisions about the Vietnam War in private and secret, and no one really knew about the debate that was going on in his administration. It was a strong, fervent debate with people like George Ball, Deputy Secretary of State, saying, you know, if you do this escalation, you're going to end up just like the French. You're going to be riding a tiger you can't get off, and ultimately you're going to have 500,000 troops in Vietnam. That's what Ball said. And everyone said, no, you're crazy. You're just being so extreme. But of course, that's where we ended up. But no one knew about that debate. And when Johnson escalated the war and went from 75,000 troops to 125,000 troops, he instructed his press secretary to say that there was no change in policy. Well, one of the things that came back and slapped Johnson in the face was the degree to which people were really angry at the degree to which they'd been deceived. Now, the difference, whatever you think of Obama's position on Afghanistan, with his decision to increase the American troops in Afghanistan, is that everyone knew exactly what was going on. They knew the debate was taking place. They knew when the meetings were occurring. They knew what the ambassador from Afghanistan thought. They knew what Robert Gates thought. They knew what the dissenters were saying. They had the whole picture in front of them. And so when the president made that speech at West Point, going over what had been decided, people had a sense at least that they had been brought into the equation. They knew what had been taking place. So it was a very different decision-making process than it took place earlier. And you know, whatever happens, it should be said that he's doing it a different way. Now, the 50% poll figure is an interesting one because at this point in his administration, Bill Clinton was at 40%. Obama's ratings when he came in were excessively high. That was largely because people, I think, were so wrapped up in the idea that he was going to somehow transform politics with a new level of bipartisanship, with a new direction of the country and stuff like that. And that couldn't help but go down. 50% is, when it gets significantly below 50%, then it's a problem. But I think that right now he's probably where one would expect him to be at this point.
Good. We have 50 people participating in this office hour session, and everyone who's watching is invited to ask a question of Professor Chafe. To do that, you send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. We're just talking about Congress, and of course the big thing that Congress is wrestling with is the health care bill. Mm-hmm. And so people have used the word historic to describe it. You're a professor of history. Is that the right term? I mean, where do you...
It has to be. I mean, we've been talking about this for 100 years, since Teddy Roosevelt. And we've not done anything about it. FDR was encouraged to add health care to the Social Security bill in 1935. And he chose not to do so. He thought they might be going too far. In 1946 and 47, Harry Truman wanted to add health insurance, but that was the beginning of the Cold War, and national health insurance was called socialized medicine, and it became a victim of the anti-communist passion of the country, and it was used domestically to kill health care. In 1965, Johnson felt that the most he could do was make a huge start on this issue by going with Medicare. And that still left the issue to be debated. In 1992, of course, it was the big issue in the presidential election. It's important to note that it became, for the first time, an issue that you could debate, really, since 1947, because the Cold War was now over. You could still talk about it being socialized medicine, but the Cold War made it possible to discuss national health insurance. In that particular instance, it was handled poorly. The Clintons, both the President and Mrs. Clinton, did not do a good job with it. There was a disorder in the nature of the priorities the Clintons put forward, and didn't get the kind of focus it needed. And it was too much done inside the task force that Hillary Clinton directed rather than being done in consultation with Congress. And so by the time it finally came out, it really had lost the kind of political support it could get, even though the president made a very strong speech on its behalf. But essentially, the disastrous failure of health care as a legislative agenda item helped to lead to the decimation of the Democratic Party in 1994 when Clinton lost Congress. So this was really kind of the final chance to get this done. And right now it looks as though we hope we will have a health care plan. It's not one that's going to satisfy everybody. It's certainly not going to satisfy people who are conservative. It's certainly not going to satisfy people on the left. But it's one that seems to be a decent start, and if it does in the end reduce the deficit and create more competition, then that will be for the benefit of everybody.
Now, you said you're an Obama supporter, so I'm guessing you're supporting the health care bill, but any chance it could go down in history as a blunder? Are there still landmines out there with this bill?
No.
It's time to do it.
No. Look, we are the only, and it's important, most Americans don't realize this. Maybe they do. We are the only industrial nation in the West that does not have national health insurance. You cannot go anywhere in the world that we generally visit, whether it be Germany, France, Britain, Sweden, South Africa, Australia. No, not South Africa. That does not have a national health plan. So we are the outsider. We are the loner. And you know what? We spend twice as much on health care as they do, per capita. Twice as much. In addition to which, our infant mortality rate is far higher, our life expectancy is lower, so we need to look at the people around us and say, why are you healthier than we, and why are you paying so much less for it?
Right, and of course the debate goes on, but another thing that's coming up for the Obama administration is the State of the Union address. Now here's a chance for the president to put his administration in historic context, hit some broad national themes. So play speechwriter here. I mean, how would you sketch that out, placing the Obama administration in the history of the U.S.?
Well, I think that if I were the president, I would start talking about the importance of moving toward being citizens of the world and acting for the common good, and point out the degree to which we are doing that at home by working on creating more jobs, creating a better health care system, the need for us to work with others to bring climate change under control, and the need for us to work toward much more multilateral relations with our allies in order to create the basis for peace in the trouble spots of the world, especially the Middle East, and certainly including the area of Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, in Iraq. It seems to me that the thing that I would point to is the importance of, A, thinking about what's best for the largest number of American people, and also B, what is best for the world as a means of coming together around problems that are universal, such as the climate.
Now, what about the conservative knock that says, hey, these little Democrats, they just look at the U.S. as one among many nations and don't look at our own national interests first?
Well, whenever we have played the role of working with allies, we have been the leader of the world. This was true in World War II. It was true in Korea. It's been true throughout the post-war period, except in those instances where we have basically acted in indifference to or ignorance of or disdain for the opinions of the rest of the world. Vietnam, Iraq. In both instances, we ended up essentially weakening substantially our position as a leader because we didn't listen to other people.
Very good. So let's get talking about civil rights, and everyone who's watching is invited to ask Professor Chafe a question. You can do that by email, live@duke.edu, on Twitter with Duke Live, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. So, Professor Chafe, we have coming up not only the one-year mark for President Obama on Wednesday, but on Monday, the national celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. Comparisons and contrasts abound. What sort of connection do you make by putting those two figures side by side?
Well, obviously, President Obama is an historic figure simply by virtue of the fact that he is a black American, a multiracial American, but most black Americans are multiracial, which you need to recognize. And so his victory is clearly a breakthrough of substantial proportion. On the other hand, he has not run as a black person. He has run as an American. He is committed to certainly issues of social justice. He's committed and uses effectively, I think, some of the rhetorical benchmarks that Martin Luther King Jr. Put out there. I think that this is actually an interesting conflation of dates, and I think it's probably appropriate. This is also, as I'm sure you are very well aware, the 50th anniversary of the Greensboro sit-ins. And when you think about the fact that 50 years ago, 4 young African-American first-year students changed history.
So tell us the date. Maybe not everybody knows the Greensboro sit-ins. February 5.
February 1.
February 1.
February 1, 1960.
Tell us.
This is Greensboro is a moderate white community, or perceives itself as moderate and white. It is white. Whether it's moderate is another question. And with a substantial black population. And Greensboro School Board had said it was going to implement the Brown decision one day after the Brown decision was handed down in 1954. Then almost nothing happened, and many black Americans were convinced that so significant change was going to take place in the aftermath of the Brown decision. Blacks in Greensboro had been fighting segregation for a long, long time. The school system, the black school, was full of teachers who were encouraging students to stand up for themselves. Black teachers who said they never rode in a Jim Crow bus. They wouldn't sit at the back of the bus, and they wouldn't go to the buzzard's roost in the balcony of the theater. And they encouraged their students to think well of themselves, to have high self-esteem. These 4 freshmen had grown up in an environment where they were very conscious of civil rights because of the Brown decision, because of the Montgomery bus boycott in '55, because of the leadership of Dr. King. But they were frustrated because nothing was changing in their lives. And they talked about it all the time during their fall year of their first year, the fall semester of their first year. And they decided they had to do something, because if they didn't do something, then they would become complicit in perpetuating the system. And it struck them that there was nothing more stupid or absurd than having a system in which you were encouraged to be a customer in a department store like Woolworth's and buy all your material goods there, but you could not have lunch at the lunch counter. And so they decided, well, let's dramatize this. And so the 4 of them went down. They went and bought toothpaste. They went and bought notebook paper. They took their receipts, and they went and sat at the lunch counter. And they said, we'd like a cup of coffee. And no one had ever done that before in Greensboro. Sit-ins had happened before, but not like this. They were told, we don't serve colored people here. And they said, well, you served us over there, you served us over here. We want to be served at the lunch counter. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. And so they opened the school books and they started to study. And the store closed and they went back to campus. There were 4 of them. The next day they came back and there were 23. The next day there were 66. The day after that there were 100. And on the 5th day there were 1,000. 1,000 people, black people, of all ages in downtown Greensboro demanding to be seated. Within 8 weeks, there were demonstrations of a similar nature in 54 cities in 9 different states. And then the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee developed out of that, and we have the Civil Rights Revolution, which leads to the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, and a dramatically changed America. Now, that happened because 4 young men decided that they could make a difference.
A movement is born. We've got an email question here that's come in from Matt, one of the viewers. We've got 184 people participating in the office hours now. Matt asks about your book, Civility and Civil Rights. He says, you argue that North Carolinians during the Civil Rights Movement appealed to civilities, politeness, to oppose or retard social change. Given what I observe about the decline of civilities in general over the last several decades, TV news, I wonder if the loss of civility has had an impact on our national discussion of civil rights, race, Obama, etc.
That's a very good question. I think that the way in which civilities were used in the 1950s and 60s, Greensboro people especially took pride in the degree to which they were quote-unquote progressive. And what I call a progressive mystique was their focus on not being physically brutal in the way in which they dealt with race, listening to different points of view, but always insisting on unanimity before any change would take place. And it was really a way in which you could use good manners as a way of preventing protest being successful. The sit-ins were kind of a way of puncturing that. They themselves were polite. The sit-in students opened their books, they wore ties, they wore jackets, they were not in any way abrasive. But they punctured the whole notion of civility. But they had to do it over and over again, not just in 1960, but then in 63 and thereafter, because there was this propensity, particularly in North Carolina, to use the rhetoric of moderation as a vehicle for suppressing social protest and social change. Now, on the other hand, civility did work for the civil rights movement because it provided a social space within which you could make that kind of sit-in protest. You couldn't do that in Jackson, Mississippi, because you would have been beaten and maybe killed. So what made possible the ascendancy of that movement over that 8-week period was partly the degree to which civility prevailed. Now, the questioner makes a very good point. We have lost civility in our political discourse. The degree to which talk radio especially has descended into really vicious kind of name-calling, which completely prevents any kind of dialogue, is very, very scary. The fact that we face today, the reality that Rush Limbaugh says we should not give any aid to Haiti because we're already paying our tax dollars for foreign affairs, that just is, there's a level of viciousness, which I think would be well replaced by some more civility. So the questioner has a very good point, and what may have been true at one point in history may not be true at another point in history.
So speaking of civility, I have to think of the incident this last year with Professor Henry Gates up in Cambridge, the incident with the Cambridge police up there with some racially charged, and it was at least putatively resolved over beers with President Obama. I mean, so contrast 1960s civil rights. Is this the new sort of face and method of race relations, civil rights?
Well, I think that the most difficult thing to come to grips with in terms of race relations and civil rights today is that there is a fundamental class issue involved with civil rights. There are enormous numbers of very successful and very powerful black people whose success has been made possible by the work of the sit-in students and others and the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act. On the other hand, that did not affect a huge number of people. So what you now have to deal with is the fact that you've got a split in a number of populations, but certainly in the black community, so that while you have a significant black middle class, you have a 30% poverty rate in the black community. So issues of race and discrimination become harder to deal with because they're embedded in a social structure which doesn't lend itself to the kind of dramatic protest that occurred with the sit-in students. It's harder to find a way of highlighting the problem with issues of poverty and institutional racism. So I think that the questions are harder to deal with. I don't think that they get solved over a beer in the Rose Garden, although that was an interesting way of handling that particular episode, where clearly there were plenty of people who had messed up.
Good. Well, we've got about 200 people participating in the office hours here, and everyone watching is invited to ask a question of Professor Chafe. You can do that by email, live@duke.edu, by tweeting with the tag Duke Live, or by posting a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor Chafe, we mentioned that you are recently back from South Africa. You've been collaborating with colleagues at Wits University there on comparing the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa with the U.S. civil rights movement. So what fresh insights are you getting from that?
Well, I'm not sure that we have them formulated, but I think that there's a fascinating kind of parallelism. There's huge differences, obviously. You've got a majority black African population and a minority black American population. On the other hand, you've got some of the same dynamics at work. You had institutional racism, you had segregation. Just as in America, a black person growing up in the 1940s was told, always get out of the way of white people walking down the sidewalk, especially white women. The same thing was true in South Africa. You could not walk on the same sidewalk. You had to use separate facilities. You could not work in the same places. So the systems are in some ways very parallel. They're also very parallel in terms of the grassroots nature of the protest that evolved to challenge those systems. The African National Congress, where Nelson Mandela played a major role, was very parallel to some of the things going on with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, and SNCC. What I think we're looking at primarily is community studies, because that community studies are really the place to find out what is shaping a movement, what is making people move in a certain direction. And we're looking at the ways in which things like religion, the role of the church, the role of gender. In both cases, you have an enormous number of women playing critical roles in these social movements. The role of labor, organized labor, working people in unions. So we're looking at how these things played out and trying to compare the influence that those various factors had, and we hope to be able to help to illuminate how it is that two movements 7,000 miles away have a lot in common, and particularly the power of the relationship between individual leaders and large groups of people.
And you've been interviewing some of the leaders of the anti-apartheid
Yes.
movement just now. Any surprises? Either I didn't realize a particular person was so influential, or I didn't realize the tactics differed there.
I think that the most interesting thing is that you see in these interviews the same kind of political dynamics. I'll tell you about two of the people I interviewed. One was a very prominent political figure, a colored person. In South Africa, you have different races. You have black Africans, you have colored people, you have Indians, and you have whites, some of whom have British ancestry, some of whom have Dutch ancestry or Afrikaners. This individual happened to be a colored person, a great leader in that community, who had been, for the most part, playing a fairly conservative role over time. On the other hand, he was supportive of the ANC and Nelson Mandela. And so that interview focused really on the way in which you negotiate with power, and he talked repeatedly about the courage of being a moderate. The courage of being a moderate and of working within the system to change the system.
When I think of moderate whites in the U.S., I think of a letter from Birmingham jail, and then in a way they were challenged.
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly. And you know, he was someone who actually worked closely with Nelson Mandela. But the other interview I did the same day was with a person who was the head of the labor unions of South Africa, much more emphatic in his criticism of the status quo, much more radical, if you will, much more demanding, but prodding for change all the time. And what was fascinating was to see the way in which those two sets of political operations, each in its own way, helped to create the circumstances that would lead to what we had with the presidency of Nelson Mandela, who, you know, after 27 years in jail, just think about that, 27 years in jail, most of it in Robben Island, working in a quarry and lifting heavy stones, someone who then became the voice of reconciliation.
So you mentioned Nelson Mandela. I think it's inescapable. Is there a comparison with Martin Luther King?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
What is it?
Well, the comparison is really someone who was, both people made it a goal of their lives to be able to reach out and speak to the other. To the other, meaning those who are unlike you.
Not in their group.
And I think one of the things that King did so brilliantly was to essentially use his position as a Christian minister and the vocabulary of the Judeo-Christian tradition to reach out to people all over the country from his home base as a black church pastor, but in a manner that everyone could understand his language and the message he was preaching and the importance of using Jesus as a model for reconciliation and justice. He did that brilliantly. And Mandela did the same thing. Mandela, if those people who will go to see the movie Invictus will note one of the most amazing things Mandela did, which was to use reconciliation and in support of the Springboks, the South African rugby team, and rugby was defined by most people as an Afrikaner sport, to use his relationship with that phenomena of rugby and the leadership of that team to show that he wanted to reach out to the other and communicate with them, and that they were all part of one society in one country. So he did a magnificent job, as did King. Mandela, if there is a saint of the 20th century, it is Nelson Mandela, and we will never see again a person of his kind. But maybe we will if we're lucky.
We have just over 200 people participating in the online office hours here, and everyone watching is invited to jump in, ask Professor Chafe a question by email live@duke.edu, with Twitter with the tag Duke Live, or by posting a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor Chafe, you were just talking about Martin Luther King and the language and rhetoric he used. You wrote an op-ed, it's a couple of years back now, that saying that when we remember Martin Luther King on the national holiday, is that we're apt to grab for the children should be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. But you're saying there's some jagged edges here.
Oh, yes.
I mean, this man has a personal relationship with Jesus. He uses the fiery language of Hebrew prophets, and he's a liberal, in foreign policy as well as in economics, as well as in social matters.
Yes.
That can get glossed over.
Yes.
So what about those rugged edges of the civil rights movement?
Well, it's terribly important to hold on to them, because I think that when we try to domesticate King, we lose the heart of his message, which was a very, very radical message, because he saw Jesus as a radical, and I believe he's right about that. And when throughout his life, Martin Luther King Jr. recognized the importance of very significant economic change as pivotal toward achieving social change and social justice. And one of the most difficult decisions he ever had to make was basically to speak out against the Vietnam War. He was opposed in that by many of the other leaders of the civil rights movement, not the people in SNCC, but the NAACP, Urban League, and others, and even within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But he felt that was a fundamental moral issue, and when he saw the picture of a baby who'd been killed in a napalm attack, he simply felt compelled to speak out, and did so. I think that as he became a more mature leader of the civil rights movement, he became even stronger in his convictions about both the need for economic change structurally, and the need for international change in terms of war. And he was a powerful spokesperson for that. And I think we demean and cheapen his impact by not recognizing the full measure of his commitment to change and justice.
Now, when Martin Luther King Day rolls around, there's obviously an opportunity to reflect on who Martin Luther King actually was, what he stood for. There's also an opportunity about who are the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. And an exchange you mentioned, Ella Baker, connected to both the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Greensboro sit-in.
Yes.
So who are those? If you get
Good.
to do a
Well,
couple
thank you.
unsung, yeah.
I mean, Ella Baker is one of the most. Ella Baker is the mother of the civil rights movement. She probably did more to bring people on board the civil rights movement than anyone, including Dr. King, because she was an NAACP. She went to Shaw University. She grew up in Warren County, North Carolina. She was an independent woman. She became a worker for the NAACP during the 30s and 40s. And she was a field worker. She was traveling on trains, in Jim Crow trains, across the South, trying to organize local chapters of the NAACP. She started the youth group of the NAACP in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1943. She always was someone with a strong personal sense of being at the cutting edge of things. When the Montgomery bus boycott took place and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed in 1956, they needed someone to help run it. And so in, I think it was 58, she became the acting executive secretary. She had a problem because she was a woman, and black pastors were not necessarily known as being supportive of women's equality. And so she challenged some of their presumptions. She didn't. She talked about the fact that sometimes people like Dr. King were prophets with feet of clay because they didn't carry things far enough. And Ella Baker was the person who suggested that the student protesters who had gone into all these five and dimes after February 1, 1960, she suggested that all the student protesters come together from all the cities that they'd done these demonstrations and have a meeting in Shaw, her alma mater, in 1960, in April. And so she did. Dr. King came and gave a speech, and the big issue was, will these students simply become an appendage of Dr. King's organization, or will they have their own organization? And she said, you guys need your own organization. She was the mother of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is also having its 50th anniversary in April in Raleigh at Shaw. And she was therefore a pivotal figure in all of that. And she was really the unifying figure for SNCC during all those years. And I had the opportunity to meet her and to interview her and to share a glass of bourbon with her.
Sounds like a great experience. So when we talk about the civil rights movement, and you mentioned SNCC, young people back in the 60s getting involved, then there's a challenge today. What's the issue of the day for today's young people? Who's the heir of the civil rights movement now? It seems that goes in a lot of different directions. How do you see that?
Well, I think that you never know what the issue is that's going to precipitate a movement. What you do need to be aware of is what's going on around you and the degree to which you do or do not feel satisfied with how things are proceeding. I think some of the things that we are doing, for example, with Duke Engage. Duke Engage is a place where young people, have the opportunity to do important things to make a difference in their own lives and in the lives of some of the people that they're working with by doing volunteer work at AIDS clinics or with policy groups, people who are working with women who are victims of sexual violence and stuff like that. So I do think that there are a whole variety of issues that young people can get involved with, and you just never know at what point there's going to come that moment which kind of brings it all together. As the sit-in movement, the four guys going to Greensboro, five and dime, did in 1960, or as the students in Soweto in 1976, who essentially said, we're not going to allow Afrikaans to be the language which we're taught, and that led to essentially a student revolt in South Africa. You never know what the issue is going to be, but the important thing is simply to be aware of what you believe in and the degree to which you understand that you can make a difference.
So talking big picture, your newest book, Rise and Fall of the American Century, has something of a provocative title there,
yes.
Implying that maybe America's past its peak, that it was the last 100 years, not the next, that is going to be most great. So I mean, look forward there. I mean, you put the title out there. So
I did.
Are you seeing a fall? Obviously, no one knows for sure, but
right.
What seeds have been planted?
Well, I think that the title really comes from the fact that in the middle of the 1940s, Henry Luce, who was the editor of Time magazine, talked about this as being the American century, because we were in charge. Mm-hmm. And everyone had to basically understand the dynamics of American leadership. And what the thesis of the book really is that this coincides with the rise of a much more powerful American state, foreign policy, leadership economically in the entire world. There then sets in a kind of decline. The decline has to do with America's now dependence on foreign oil, the degree to which the American economy is very much in competition with that of China and other of non-Western countries, the degree to which, through foreign policy mistakes, from my point of view, like Vietnam and Iraq, America has lost its kind of beacon leadership role. And then the question is, does that mean that it's gone forever, or is there, or what are the lessons of those changes? And from my point of view, the lessons are that if you want to play a major role as the leader of the world, you have to be out front on issues that other people are going to respect and respond to, among which would be the environment, climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, peace in unstable areas of the world, and issues of justice. So it's an open question whether there is a permanent fall or whether it's just to some extent a momentary decline from a position of unchallenged prominence.
Very good. We've got about 240 people participating in the online office hours, and Ben and Samantha say they're enjoying the conversation. So this is going to be your last chance here to ask a question of Professor Chafe. To do that, you can tweet with the tag Duke Live, send an email to live@duke.edu, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. So as we start to wrap up and put these things all together, in your writing, an important theme you've mentioned is Commonwealth for this nation. So talk about what's the importance of America being a Commonwealth.
Well, Commonwealth really goes back to the beginnings of the country when states like Massachusetts and Virginia were both Commonwealths. And it goes back to John Winthrop's sermon on the Arabella when the Puritans came to Massachusetts, where his model of Christian charity, where he said, we are trying to become a community with a covenant with God, where we care about each other, we mourn with each other, we celebrate with each other, we take care of each other. We have essentially a common good that we are guided by. Ever since then, there's really been a kind of an ongoing tension between the idea of a common good and the idea of individual rights and individual pursuit of one's own ambitions, etc. And at different points in time, one or the other has been dominant. Certainly during much of the 19th century, the whole idea of laissez-faire capitalism, individualism, was very much more prominent. Then with the 20th century, you have this massive industrialization, the development of huge trusts, huge immigrant populations coming in, and you have the beginnings of a concern with what do we need to do to protect ourselves, to create a morally sound base. So you have child labor legislation passed, you have factory safety legislation, you have legislation protecting women. These are basically acting for the common good. During the New Deal, you have the Social Security Act, you have the recovery of the farmers. During World War II, you have this whole focus on us as a community. And then you have, again, the episodes of the Great Society and some of the things that have taken place since then. All this, there's always been this tension between these two sets of values. So I think that remains a common issue. I think that it's important to talk about that tension and to recognize that moving toward the common good does not necessarily mean the elimination of individualism. What it really means is the cooperation within a larger framework.
I thought, interestingly, you said you've been a supporter of liberal values and President Obama, but a few years back, if you can remember an op-ed you wrote challenging the Democratic Party and saying, hey, the Democrats have gotten too far into identity politics and have lost this vision of Commonwealth. That was 3-4 years ago. I mean, have they done it? Have they heeded your call, as it were? Is there work to do there?
Well, there's always work to do. I do think that the Democratic Party needs to do some work on its own, looking at itself. I think identity politics is less an issue now, and more of an issue for the Democrats is trying to figure out how they can work with each other and with Republicans to develop a different kind of agenda. I think there is certainly, we should not give up on bipartisanship. I was impressed, as someone who spends part of his time living in Maine, with the role that Olympia Snowe played on the Senate Finance Committee on the health care issue. I think it is possible to have that kind of open discussion. But I also think that there has to be an end to some of the viciousness of the political rhetoric that's once again seeming to take over our political discourse.
So let me put you in conversation with some of your colleagues here at Duke with kind of a challenge, and that is in comparing and contrasting President Bush, who you've been quite critical of, and then President Obama, is both Professor Peter Feaver was in here saying, hey, there's a lot of continuity in foreign policy between Obama and Bush. Professor David Schanzer studies Homeland Security and terrorism and said, hey, don't call Obama soft on terrorism. He's basically keeping the personnel and tactics of Bush. There's a lot of continuity there. Here in the epilogue, when you point out the discontinuity, there's a big shift. So what about that argument that, American presidents, they're dealing with the same set of circumstances, and even if the style is different, in substance they're the same?
Well, I think that there is a lot of continuity, and especially when you talk about you're talking about a national security team, which has people who are not partisan and who are part of the same operation enterprise. And there's a huge amount of continuity in the way in which they operate, and I've found that some of the commentaries that have been made in the last few weeks about the Christmas episode suggest the degree to which people like Negroponte, who was very active with the other, and others, have this very common perspective on these issues. And I think Peter Feaver was right about the fact that there is some degree of continuity in foreign policy, and obviously the State Department, for the most part, never changes. The personnel are the same. I do think that what's important is what message gets conveyed about the directions and the nuances of directions that are being taken. My basic view would be that Richard Cheney was the president in effect during much of the Bush administration. I think George W. Bush was a committed leader with a very generous personality, but who didn't listen hard enough to the people who had another point of view. And I think that one of the things that you're seeing here, I think in the Obama administration, is more points of view being expressed and more discussion taking place in a way that allows for consideration of a multiple set of options.
Very good. Well, thank you for coming in and doing these office hours. To wrap up, we're coming up on Martin Luther King Day, 1-year anniversary of President Obama in office. So you're a professor. What's an assignment? What should people be thinking about? What to read? What to look for as we come up to these days?
Well, I think you should. I think it would be great to read some of Taylor Branch's stuff on Dr. King, which are brilliant books to talk a lot about his character and the role of religion in his life. I think it'd be great to read Barack Obama's Dreams of My Father, because that really speaks to how and why he surmounted the challenge of figuring out what his identity was. So I think there's lots of stuff out there to look at. It would be good to read some books on the environment, I think, and what some of the challenges we face there are. It would be good to read something hopeful about the Middle East. Because that's the problem that ultimately is the most serious one we face in the world of politics.
Very good, Professor Chafe. Thank you for holding your office hours online here, and we should say that you're working on a book on the Clintons with Hill and Wong Press, so we'll have our eyes out for that. Everyone watching is invited to return to Duke's Ustream channel on Tuesday at 7 p.m. for a Duke Reads conversation with Professor Reynolds Price on Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Duke is commemorating the life of Martin Luther King Jr. here on campus, including a keynote address Sunday by labor leader Dolores Huerta. For more information about that, go to mlk.duke.edu. And for more about Duke, visit duke.edu.